The storm swept across the high prairie like the wrath of an angry god, transforming the endless grassland into a silver ocean beneath howling winds. Lightning cracked the darkening sky as evening descended over the American frontier, and thunder rolled across the vast emptiness with the sound of distant artillery. In the bed of a lurching freight wagon, pulled by two terrified mules, 14-year-old Elise Hart pressed herself against rough wooden planks, her blonde hair whipping around her face as the tempest bore down with merciless fury. Coarse rope had carved deep welts into her slender wrists during hours of frantic struggling, leaving raw circles that throbbed with each jolt of the wagon. A grimy cloth had been wedged between her arms to prevent her from reaching anything useful, a calculated cruelty that spoke of meticulous planning rather than spontaneous violence. Her blue cotton dress, once neat and appropriate for a frontier schoolgirl, now hung torn and stained with dust perspiration and her own blood. Behind her, on the driver's bench, sat Tokala, a Lakota warrior whose weathered features bore the harsh lines carved by 33 difficult years. His traditional buckskin clothing and beaded vest were practical rather than ceremonial, but the magnificent war bonnet of eagle feathers crowning his dark hair would instantly catch any white pursuer's attention. Worn not for ritual, but as deliberate bait to draw focus and purchase precious seconds of hesitation from men conditioned to fear such symbols. His right leg carried the permanent stiffness of an old bullet wound that had never properly healed, forcing him to compensate with his left side as he gripped leather reins and fought to control the panicked animals. The pursuing riders materialized from the storm like vengeful spirits, their torches guttering in the gale as they closed distance with methodical determination. At their head rode Reverend Abel Thorne, his gaunt frame wrapped in a black coat that snapped like bat wings in the wind. Though appearing to be in his early 50s, hardship and bitter disappointment had etched premature lines around pale eyes and thin lips. Once he had owned silver mines in these very hills, digging deep for wealth that ultimately eluded his grasp. When the veins played out and creditors came calling, he had reinvented himself as a man of God, though his sermons spoke more of wrath and retribution than mercy and forgiveness. Faster. Thorne's voice sliced through the wind like a blade reaching his dozen followers despite the storm's fury. The heathen savage has stolen our lamb. We cannot permit such blasphemy. The men behind him drove their horses, harder rifles and pistols gleaming dully in lightning flashes. They had spent the afternoon in Thorne's makeshift church, listening to passionate speeches about drought and divine punishment, about the necessity of a harvest penance to lift God's curse from their suffering community. Terror and desperation had made them willing to believe that an orphan girl's death might somehow bring rain to withered fields and water to dying cattle. As the wagon wheel struck a prairie dog burrow, Elise felt herself thrown against the side rail with enough force to drive breath from her lungs. The impact sent fresh agony through her bound arms, and she bit her lower lip hard to prevent crying out. But as hoofbeats thundered closer and rifle shots cracked through the air, terror finally overwhelmed her fragile composure. "Please don't sacrifice me," she whispered, voice barely audible above the storm's roar. Her teeth chattered from cold fear and bone-deep understanding that her young life hung by the thinnest thread. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong." Tokala's dark eyes met hers for one brief moment, and she saw something unexpected there. Not the savage cruelty she'd been taught to expect from Indians, but profound and familiar anguish. It was the expression of someone who had lost everything precious and would not allow it to happen again under his watch. "You belong to yourself," he replied firmly, his accent lending gravity to words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "No man owns your life or death." Then bullets began splintering the wooden tailboard behind them, making conversation impossible. With movements born of desperate necessity and long experience, Tokala drew his razor-sharp skinning knife and slashed through leather traces, connecting the mules to the wagon tongue. The panicked animals needed no encouragement when he struck the nearest one sharply across the rump, their hooves churning up great clouds of prairie dust as they plunged ahead into gathering darkness. The sudden acceleration nearly pitched Elise from the wagon bed, but the ropes that bound her now served as a lifeline, preventing a fatal tumble onto iron-hard ground. Their freight wagon lurched and bounced over rough terrain iron-shod wheels, finding precarious purchase on stones and dried earth, while more shots rang out from the pursuing mob. Tokala wrapped reins around his left hand and hauled them hard to starboard, steering their runaway conveyance toward a shallow depression he'd spotted in the prairie floor. A dry creek bed, promising precious cover from rifles behind them. The wagon struck the embankment at dangerous speed, became airborne for one heart-stopping moment, then crashed down into sandy bottom with bone-jarring violence that made every timber groan. Elise felt her shoulders slam against the side rail as stars exploded across her vision. But they were alive and momentarily shielded from direct fire by the raised banks of the ancient watercourse. Above them, she could hear Thorne's voice bellowing orders, while orange muzzle flashes painted brief, hellish pictures against the storm-dark sky. The town of Cinder Bluff, huddled between the winding Snake River and exhausted silver mines of Eagle Ridge, like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Founded during the mining boom of the early 1870s, it had swollen to nearly 2,000 souls at its peak, with saloons and gambling halls stretching 6 blocks along dusty Main Street. But silver had played out by 1880, and big companies had moved on, leaving nothing but scarred hillsides and abandoned shafts. Now, in drought-stricken autumn of 1887, fewer than 400 people called the town home. The Grand Territorial Hotel stood empty windows, boarded like dead eyes. Half the storefronts displayed faded "for sale" signs, gathering dust for years. The local economy survived on cattle ranching, minimal farming where soil cooperated, and occasional freight wagons passing through to somewhere more prosperous. But 3 years of drought had pushed the community to breaking point. Spring rains had failed consistently, forcing ranchers to drive herds farther upstream each season, seeking adequate water. Crops withered in fields that once produced abundant harvests, and even remaining mines had shut down when pumps could no longer draw enough groundwater to prevent flooding with poisonous seepage. Into this atmosphere of terror and desperation had stepped Reverend Abel Thorne, arriving on the weekly stage with nothing but a battered Bible and talent for reading the darkest corners of men's hearts. He'd rented the abandoned Presbyterian church for Sunday services and quickly gathered a following among the most frightened residents, preaching sermons promising divine intervention in exchange for moral purification. His most valuable ally proved to be Deputy Caleb Pike, a weathered lawman in his late 30s, serving as the town's primary peace officer. Pike had worn a badge for 15 years, first as town marshal in Kansas cattle towns, then as territorial deputy in Colorado mining camps, where violence was as common as morning coffee. The work had left him cynical and practical, more concerned with maintaining order than pursuing abstract concepts like justice. Pike's vulnerability was brutally simple. He needed his position. His young wife had died of consumption 2 years earlier, leaving crushing medical debts and a drinking problem he worked hard to conceal. When Thorne arrived with talk of community renewal, Pike saw opportunity to align himself with rising power in local politics. The third crucial figure was Miss Beatrice Rowan, Cinder Bluff's schoolteacher, and one of the few residents brave enough to openly challenge Thorne's growing influence. 28 years old and determinedly unmarried, she'd come west from Boston 5 years earlier with idealistic dreams of bringing education to frontier children. It was Beatrice who had taken responsibility for Elise Hart when the girl arrived on a westbound wagon train 6 months earlier, accompanied by nothing but a cloth bundle and a story of loss that had become all too familiar on the frontier. "Found her in Independence, Missouri, miss," the gruff wagon master had explained while standing in the schoolhouse doorway. "Mother died of fever, no other family we could locate. Girl claims she can read and cipher, some figured she might be useful as an assistant." Elise had stood behind the man, like a frightened deer clutching her small bundle, while Blue Eyes took in everything, with the particular wariness of a child who'd learned not to trust too quickly. Her fair hair was tangled and dirty from weeks on the trail, her simple dress patched and repatched by careful hands that would never sew again. The arrangement had worked beautifully. Elise proved intelligent and eager to learn, helping with younger children while continuing her own education. Her most treasured possession was a simple pewter locket containing a tintype photograph of her mother, the only tangible connection to the family she'd lost. But their peaceful existence had been shattered 3 days ago, when a sudden dust storm brought down the roof of Miller's grain storage barn. In the confusion that followed, someone accused her of stealing wheat from the damaged building. The accusation was completely false, but in the current atmosphere of suspicion, truth mattered less than the community's desperate need for someone to blame. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cinder Bluff's freight yard as Tokala guided his paint horse between rows of supply wagons. He'd arrived the previous evening carrying dispatches from the territorial Indian agent, but the official business could wait. The rumors he'd heard were becoming more specific and more disturbing. Near the back of the yard, partially concealed behind stacks of mining timber, he spotted what he was looking for were Thorne's followers preparing specialized equipment. The items being assembled told a chilling story. Heavy iron rings had been bolted to the sides of a small ore cart, clearly designed to hold chains or ropes. A wooden stake sharpened to a cruel point and stained dark lay nearby, along with leather restraints and a cloth gag. The men worked with practiced efficiency, following detailed instructions, suggesting careful advanced planning. Reverend wants everything ready by sunset. One was saying a thin man with tobacco-stained teeth. Says the girl might struggle during the ceremony. What happens afterward? Asked another worker, a burly freight handler. What do we do with, The first man shrugged with casual indifference. Reverend says the Lord will provide guidance. Our job is just making sure everything goes according to his will. Tokala felt his jaw tighten as he listened to this casual discussion of murder, disguised as religious duty. As he prepared to withdraw, a piece of paper partially hidden beneath a crate caught his attention. Moving carefully to avoid attracting notice, he retrieved the document. The paper was a torn page from a financial ledger written in neat clerical hand. Most entries were obscured by water damage, but several crucial lines remained legible. Payment received from Rail and Water Company, $500. Operational expenses, obstacle removal, $200. Balance held, final payment upon completion, $800. Priority targets, school building teacher B. Rowan, orphan ward. Tokala studied the document with growing anger and disbelief. This wasn't religious fanaticism, it was cold-blooded business. Someone was being paid substantial sums to orchestrate violence, to remove specific individuals standing in the way of some larger commercial enterprise. Before he could examine the ledger page more thoroughly, voices erupted from the main street as a crowd gathered around the schoolhouse. Tokala quickly folded the incriminating document and tucked it inside his vest, then mounted his horse and rode toward the disturbance. He arrived just as Deputy Pike emerged from the schoolhouse, roughly escorting Elise Hart between two of Thorne's followers, while the girl's hands were bound behind her back. Her face was pale with confusion and terror, but she held her head high with dignity that reminded Tokala painfully of his own daughter during her final illness. What authority gives you the right to take her? Beatrice Rowan's voice rang out from the doorway, her composure shattered by maternal fury. I am her legal guardian. Pike held up an official-looking document, though his reluctance to meet Beatrice's eyes suggested discomfort. Court order here, Miss Rowan. The girl's been remanded to Reverend Thorne's custody pending investigation of theft charges and other matters. What other matters? Beatrice demanded. Thorne moved forward with smooth confidence. Miss Rowan, your emotional attachment has blinded you to signs of deeper corruption. The theft was merely the most obvious symptom. There are indications. that she's been in communication with hostile elements, Indians and other undesirable influences threatening our community's safety. It was a masterfully crafted lie. In the current atmosphere of fear, mere suggestion of collaboration with Native Americans would turn public opinion against the girl. Tokala could see doubt creeping into faces that had known Elise for months. Tokala urged his horse closer, drawing curious stares. When within speaking distance, he addressed Pike directly with calm authority. "Deputy, I believe there may be confusion regarding the girl's legal status. As an official interpreter for the territorial Indian agent, I have considerable experience with custody matters involving orphaned children. That document you're holding, might I examine it?" Pike's hand moved instinctively toward his holstered revolver. "This doesn't concern you, Indian. Move along. Actually, it very much concerns me. The territorial agent has jurisdiction over all matters involving accusations of criminal conspiracy with Native American tribes. If the girl is suspected of such activities, federal law requires transfer to territorial custody for proper investigation." It was complete fabrication, but delivered with enough bureaucratic authority to give Pike pause. The deputy glanced uncertainly at Thorne, who had gone very still. "The matter is entirely local," Thorne said after consideration. "The girl's alleged crimes are against this community. Perhaps, but the accusations you've made communication with hostile Indians, possible collaboration, those fall under federal jurisdiction. I'm certain you understand the importance of following proper legal procedures, Reverend." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but one of Thorne's followers chose that moment to lose patience. "Enough talk," he snarled, drawing his pistol. "We don't take orders from no redskin." The gun's appearance transformed everything. Several townspeople began backing away, suddenly understanding they were witnessing something far more serious than a custody dispute. Pike's hand dropped to his weapon, though he seemed uncertain which side to support. Elise, who had stood silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly grasped what was happening. "They're planning to kill me," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper, but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Aren't they? That's what this is really about." Her words struck the crowd like a physical blow. The girl's terror was so raw and genuine that it cut through Thorne's careful rhetoric, revealing brutal truth beneath religious justifications. Tokala recognized his opportunity and seized it. In one fluid motion, drawing upon 30 years of warrior training, he spurred his horse forward and reached down to pull Elise up behind him. The ropes binding her wrists parted under his razor-sharp knife, and her arms came free just as the first shot rang out. "Stop them!" Thorne's voice cracked with fury as he realized his plans were collapsing. "Don't let the girl escape." More shots followed as Tokala wheeled his horse toward the freight yard where he'd spotted a loaded wagon. He managed to lift Elise down into the wagon bed before quickly cutting harness traces, switching the mule team from heavy freight to a lighter cart that would move faster across open terrain. "You hold tight," he told her grimly as he climbed onto the driver's seat. "This is going to be very dangerous." Behind them, Pike was shouting orders to form a posse, while Thorne offered increasingly large cash rewards for their capture. The entire town erupted into chaos as people chose sides and gathered weapons. Tokala slapped reins against the mules' backs, and their cart lurched into motion just as an organized volley shattered the morning air. As they raced across open prairie, with an armed mob forming behind them, Tokala realized his plan to gather information and negotiate peaceful resolution had collapsed completely. Now they were fugitives, branded as criminals, with nowhere to run except the vast and unforgiving wilderness. But the girl was alive and free, which was more than he'd dared hope moments earlier. As long as she remained breathing, there was still chance that justice might prevail. The Snake River appeared before them like a silver ribbon winding through darkness, its current running higher than Tokala had expected due to recent mountain snowmelt. He'd been counting on crossing at Miller's Ford, but the water level had clearly risen beyond safe limits. "Can we make it across?" Elise asked, her voice steadier now, though he could still detect underlying tremors of exhaustion and fear. Tokala studied the churning water, noting how it foamed around partially submerged rocks that normally marked safe crossing points. The current is dangerous, but we have no choice. Thorne's men will reach us within the hour. Behind them, distant torch glow marked their pursuers' position as they followed the obvious trail left by iron-shod wheels. The posse had been delayed by organization needs, but they were coming relentlessly now. Tokala urged the mules down the muddy bank toward water's edge, where the animals balked instinctively. Their ears flattened, and they tried backing away from the threatening current. But hunger and thirst eventually drove them forward when he allowed them time to drink. The first several yards went smoothly with water barely reaching the cart's axles. But the river bottom was treacherous, composed of loose gravel and shifting sand providing uncertain footing. Without warning, the lead animal stepped into a concealed depression and plunged chest-deep into current. Its panicked thrashing caused the second mule to lose footing, and suddenly the entire cart was tilting dangerously as rushing water poured over the sides. "Stay down!" Tokala shouted over the river's roar as he wrapped reins around his wrist and jumped into icy water beside the cart. The cold was like a physical blow, driving breath from his lungs and immediately aggravating his old bullet wound. The cart was tilting toward complete rollover that would dump them both into water too deep and fast for survival. Fighting against the current's pull and fire in his injured leg, Tokala managed to get his shoulder against the cart's frame and push with all remaining strength. But Elise proved she possessed reserves of courage her small frame concealed. Instead of panicking, she braced her back against the cart's side and used both legs to push against a heavy supply chest, creating enough counterbalance to prevent complete capsizing. Water swirled around her waist, but she maintained position despite cold and mounting terror. That was when the first bullets arrived. Advance scouts of Thorne's posse had reached the riverbank and opened fire immediately upon spotting their quarry trapped in treacherous water. The range was considerable and lighting poor, but several shots came close enough to send up geysers near the struggling cart. "Keep your head down." Tokala gasped, straining every muscle to prevent the cart from being swept downstream while bullets whined overhead. One shot struck the wooden seat with sharp crack, sending splinters flying like wooden shrapnel. The pain actually helped providing adrenaline surge he needed to heave the cart toward deeper water, where current would carry them away from shore-based shooters. The surviving mule found solid footing and began swimming strongly toward the opposite bank. They were halfway across when Tokala's injured leg betrayed him completely. The old bullet wound, aggravated by cold water and extreme stress, locked up in agony that dropped him to his knees in the river. For a terrifying moment, he thought consciousness was slipping away. But Elise's voice cut through his pain like a lifeline. "I can see the bottom. It's getting shallower." She was right. The far side was rising toward a gravel beach where cartwheels were beginning to find purchase. Tokala forced himself upright and stumbled alongside the vehicle as it rolled up out of the killing water. Behind them, shooting had stopped temporarily. Thorne's men faced the same dangerous crossing, and they would need time to find safer passage. It was precious reprieve, but Tokala knew it wouldn't last long. "Help me with the harness," he said through gritted teeth, leaning heavily against the cart as muscle spasms racked his damaged leg. "We must cut the dead animal free and find shelter." Elise climbed down with water streaming from her soaked dress, but her hands were steady as she helped untangle leather traces and free the surviving mule from its drowned partner's weight. She tore a strip from her petticoat and used it to bind the worst cuts on his shoulder. "Where do we go now?" she asked as they led the exhausted mule toward a stand of cottonwood trees. Tokala looked back across the river where torchlight was spreading along the shore. "North, toward the old mining district. The terrain there is rough enough to lose pursuit, and there are people who might help if we can reach them." "What people?" "A man named Badger, who used to keep records for mining companies." "Someone who might have information about the people trying to kill you." As they worked deeper into the trees, dragging salvage supplies behind them, neither noticed the piece of paper that slipped from Tokala's wet vest and fell into mud beside the river. The torn ledger page with its incriminating evidence now lay sodden and unreadable. But somewhere in the mining country ahead, other documents waited to tell the same story if they could survive long enough to find them. Dawn was breaking when they discovered the abandoned railroad handcar, sitting on rusted tracks like mechanical salvation. The pump-operated vehicle had been left behind when the Silver Knife Mining Company pulled out 2 years earlier, abandoning the spur line as too expensive to maintain. "Do you know how to operate this?" Elise asked, running her hand along the worn platform. "I have observed railroad crews using similar equipment." Tokala replied, though his experience was limited to watching from distance. "We pump the handle up and down in coordinated rhythm, and it should propel us faster than foot travel." They'd spent a cold, miserable night hiding in a drainage culvert while Thorne's men searched with torches and dogs. The posse had eventually found their trail, but the scent had been broken by river passage, buying precious hours to put additional distance between themselves and relentless pursuers. Now, with sun climbing toward midday and enemies surely organizing systematic search, they needed speed more than stealth. The handcar represented their best chance of reaching the mining district before Thorne could bring superior numbers and firepower to bear. Tokala positioned himself at one side of the pump handle while Elise took the other, and together they began rhythmic motion that would propel their improvised vehicle along abandoned tracks. The mechanism was stiff from disuse, but after several minutes of coordinated effort, they felt the car begin rolling forward. The rail line followed a natural corridor through hills cutting through terrain impossible for wagon travel, but perfectly suited to railroad engineering. As they pumped, Tokala found himself thinking about the lost ledger page and wondering how they could prove the connection between Thorne and the Rail and Water Company without that crucial evidence. "Tell me about this Badger person," Elise said as they crested a rise and began a downhill stretch, allowing them to coast. Tokala wiped sweat from his forehead and gathered his thoughts. Thomas Badger worked as clerk and bookkeeper for the Silver Knife Mining Company until operations closed. But he was more than simple record keeper. He had a reputation for helping people who couldn't read or write understand contracts and agreements they were signing. That sounds honest. Yes, but it made him very unpopular with employers. Many miners were immigrants with limited English, and owners preferred keeping them ignorant about working conditions and legal rights. Badger would explain what contracts actually said, help workers understand what they were agreeing to, warn them about dangerous assignments. They reached the hill's bottom and resumed pumping as tracks began climbing toward a gap in the ridgeline. Behind them, a dust cloud suggested their pursuers had found horses and were following the rail line. Eventually, the mining company dismissed him, but Badger remained in the district and continued helping people independently. Miners said he kept detailed records of covered-up accidents, violated contracts, bribes paid to territorial officials, and other irregularities companies wanted secret. "Then you think he might have records involving Thorne? If Thorne has been receiving money from the Rail and Water Company to cause trouble along their intended route, there would be a paper trail. Large corporations document all expenditures for tax purposes. They just disguise illegal payments as consulting fees." A rifle shot echoed off the hills behind them, followed by several more in rapid succession. Their pursuers were closer than Tokala had realized, close enough to see the handcar and attempt long-range shots. "Faster," he urged, and they both put their backs into pumping with renewed urgency. The handcar accelerated along a straight section, offering no cover from following riders. Deputy Pike's voice carried clearly, despite distance. "Stop where you are. You're under arrest." Another volley rang out, and this time, Tokala heard the distinctive whine of bullets passing overhead. One shot struck a railroad tie near the handcar's front, sending up wooden splinters and creosote. "There." Elise pointed ahead where tracks curved around a rocky outcropping. "If we can reach that curve, they won't be able to see us." But Tokala's injured leg was cramping severely from repetitive pumping, sending spikes of agony through his hip and knee with each stroke. The old bullet wound had never healed properly, leaving him with permanent damage-limiting endurance during physical exertion. They were still 30 yards from the life-saving curve when his leg gave out completely. He collapsed against the platform with a grunt of pain as muscle spasms locked his entire right side. "I cannot continue," he gasped through clenched teeth. "You must save yourself, jump off and run where they cannot follow with horses." "Absolutely not," Elise replied with determination that surprised them both. Moving to the handle's center, she attempted to operate it single-handedly. "We started this together." She was stronger than her frame suggested, but operating the handcar alone was beyond a 14-year-old girl's capabilities. The vehicle began slowing as they approached the crucial curve, and behind them, hoofbeats grew steadily louder. That was when Tokala spotted the brake mechanism and realized they had another option. Instead of trying to go faster, he threw his weight against the brake lever, causing the handcar to screech to a sudden halt just as it entered the curve and disappeared from pursuers' view. "Help me lift it," he commanded, ignoring fire in his leg as he grabbed one end of the heavy platform. "We need to get this off the tracks." Working together despite exhaustion and injuries, they managed to tip the handcar off rails and roll it down a steep embankment into brush and fallen timber. Moments later, they heard the posse thunder around the curve above them, riders spreading out to search when they realized their quarry had vanished. Where could they have gone? Pike's frustrated voice drifted down from the tracks. "People don't just disappear. Maybe they jumped off and ran into those rocks," suggested another voice. "We should search on foot. That Indian's leg is slowing him down." From their hiding place beneath the overturned handcar, Tokala and Elise listened as the search party divided into smaller groups and began working through rough terrain on both sides of the railroad cut. They would have to move soon before the search net tightened completely. But first, Tokala needed to address his leg injury before it became completely incapacitating. Elise helped him bind the damaged muscle tightly with strips torn from her dress, creating compression that might prevent the worst swelling. "Can you walk?" she whispered. "I will walk," he replied grimly, though they both knew his mobility was severely compromised. "The question is how far?" They waited until search teams had moved past their position and then began working their way up the opposite side of the railroad, cut through loose rock and thorny brush. The granite walls were steep but offered handholds for determined climbers. And more importantly, they would conceal the fugitives from anyone searching along tracks below. Halfway up the slope, Elise's foot dislodged a loose stone that went clattering down into the cut with sound like breaking pottery. They froze instantly, listening for any indication the noise had been noticed. "Over here." The shout came from less than 100 yards away. "I heard something fall." Footsteps began running along gravel roadbed as searchers converged on their area. Tokala grabbed Elise's hand and began climbing faster, pulling her up the rocky slope, despite agony in his leg and growing numbness in his infected shoulder. They reached the ridgetop just as the first searcher appeared at the cut's bottom directly below them. For one heart-stopping moment, hunter and hunted stared at each other across the gap, then the man raised his rifle and took careful aim. Tokala shoved Elise behind a granite boulder, just as the shot rang out stone chips stinging their faces as the bullet struck rock, inches from where her head had been. More shouts erupted from below as other search party members rushed to join the chase. "This way," Tokala said, leading her along the ridge toward a maze of wind-carved rock formations, providing better concealment. "Stay low and keep moving." Behind them, they could hear Pike organizing coordinated assault on their position, directing men to circle around both ridge ends, while others provided covering fire. It was professional tactics, the kind Pike had learned during years as a lawman in places where violence was daily occurrence. They had perhaps 5 minutes before encirclement was complete. As they scrambled through the rock maze, dodging between boulders and through narrow crevices barely accommodating their bodies, Elise spotted something that made her heart leap with desperate hope, a thin column of smoke rising from a hidden valley beyond the ridge. "There," she pointed with excitement. "Someone has a fire." Tokala followed her gaze and nodded grimly. It represented their only chance, but reaching the valley would require crossing open ground where they'd be visible to anyone with field glasses. They would have to trust to speed luck and their pursuers' confusion. "When we break from cover," he told her seriously, "run straight toward that smoke and don't look back regardless of what happens to me. Whatever you hear or see, don't stop running until you find help. I won't leave you behind. You will if I order it. Your life has value beyond anything I can offer. You're young with decades ahead, while I'm just an aging warrior with a bad leg and too many enemies." Before she could argue, approaching voices forced them into motion. They broke from rocks at a desperate run, Tokala's limp more pronounced, but his determination undiminished. Behind them, shouts of discovery erupted as pursuers spotted movement across open ground. Rifles cracked in ragged volley bullets, kicking up dust and stone fragments around their feet as they raced toward the valley rim. Tokala felt something tug at his vest, looked down to see a neat bullet hole through leather, just above his heart, close enough to remind him how quickly their flight could end in death. The ground dropped away beneath their feet as they approached the valley's edge, and suddenly they were sliding down a steep, tailless slope in a controlled avalanche of loose rock and dust. Elise lost footing partway down and went tumbling, but managed to turn her fall into rolling motion that brought her to her feet at bottom with nothing worse than scraped hands and torn clothing. Tokala was not so fortunate. His damaged leg betrayed him completely on the unstable slope, and he pitched forward in a headlong fall that sent him bouncing and rolling down the incline like a broken doll. By the time he reached valley floor, his vision was blurred and he could taste blood where he'd bitten his tongue. But they had reached their destination alive, and the smoke source was now visible, a small but well-maintained cabin tucked against the cliff base, surrounded by a vegetable garden and corral containing several horses. Someone definitely lived here, in this hidden refuge, someone who might be willing to help desperate fugitives, or who might turn them over to Pike's posse for reward money. The cabin door opened to reveal a tall, lean man in his early 60s, with wild white hair and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore rough clothing of a prospector or mountain hermit, but there was something about his bearing suggesting education beneath the rustic exterior. "Oh, well, I'll be thoroughly damned," the man said, looking them over with amused curiosity rather than alarm. "You two wouldn't happen to be the fugitives that half the territorial law enforcement establishment is hunting?" Elise felt her heart sink. If their notoriety had spread this far, they were in more trouble than imagined. But the stranger's tone seemed entertained rather than threatening, and he made no move toward any weapon. "That depends on who's asking," Tokala replied carefully. "Thomas Badger's the name," the man said with a slight smile. "And if you're running from Abel Thorne and his collection of fools, then you're welcome at my fire. You're Badger." Elise stared with new interest and growing hope. The clerk who used to work for the Silver Knife Mining Company, former clerk, current archivist, and general pain in the posterior of corrupt officials throughout this territory. Badger corrected with evident pride. "Now come inside quickly before those idiots with rifles figure out how to get down here. We have considerable business to discuss." The cabin's interior was a complete revelation. What had seemed from outside to be a simple prospector's shack was actually a sophisticated archive and research facility. Wooden filing cabinets lined every wall, filled with folders and document boxes, organized according to some complex system only Badger understood. A large oak table dominated the center room, its surface covered with papers, maps, and what appeared to be legal briefs in various preparation stages. Oil lamps provided steady illumination, and a pot-bellied stove kept the interior warm despite mountain altitude. "Don't mind the organized chaos," Badger said, clearing chairs for his visitors. I'm in final stages of preparing what I believe will be a rather explosive report for the Territorial Attorney General. Your dramatic arrival is actually quite fortuitous. As Elise helped Tokala into a chair and began examining his injuries, she noticed that many documents on the table bore familiar letterheads: the Rail and Water Company, several territorial government agencies, and various mining enterprises that had operated in the region. You know about Thorne's connection to the railroad? She asked. Oh, my dear child, I know considerably more than that. Badger replied, moving to one of his filing cabinets and extracting a thick folder. I know that Abel Thorne is actually Abel Thorne, wanted for confidence schemes in 3 states. I know that the Rail and Water Company has been systematically acquiring strategic properties through fraud and intimidation. And most importantly, I know that your personal involvement goes far deeper than you realize. He spread several documents across the table, and Elise gasped as she recognized her own name on multiple official papers she'd never seen before. This, Badger explained, pointing to an elaborate legal document with territorial seal, is a forged guardianship order claiming you were placed in Thorne's custody by a Kansas probate court following your mother's death. Complete fabrication, but it would give him legal authority over your welfare and property. What property? Elise asked, studying the document with growing confusion. I don't own anything except my clothes and a locket. Badger's expression grew serious as he produced another paper, a deed bearing the Territorial Land Office's official seal. This is a property claim filed by your mother under her maiden name, Elizabeth Mason, shortly before her death. A 40-acre tract along the Snake River, including the ferry crossing at Miller's Ford and mineral rights to the entire section. Elise stared at the deed in complete shock. My mother owned land here, but she never mentioned property in the territories. She told me we were going to stay with relatives in California. She probably didn't realize how valuable her claim would become. Badger continued gently. When she originally filed paperwork, it was just a remote river crossing with no commercial significance. But now that the railroad wants to build a spur line serving the mining district, that ferry crossing has become a crucial bottleneck controlling access to millions of dollars worth of mineral extraction and transportation rights. Tokala leaned forward despite his pain. So Thorne arranged to become Elise's guardian, to gain control of her inheritance, and sell it to the railroad. Precisely. And if something unfortunate happened to the girl before she reached legal majority, say, during a tragic incident involving hostile Indians, then the property would revert to territorial government control and be auctioned to the highest bidder. The Rail and Water Company could acquire it for a fraction of its true value, while maintaining complete deniability. The implications struck Elise like physical blows. He was planning to murder me for land I didn't even know I owned. I'm afraid so. And Miss Rowan had become an additional problem because she was asking uncomfortable questions about the legality of your custody arrangement. Much simpler to eliminate both of you during the same carefully orchestrated incident. Badger moved to another filing cabinet and withdrew a detailed territorial map marked with colored pins and drawn lines. This shows their operations' full scope. Over the past 3 years, the Rail and Water Company has acquired controlling interests in water rights along more than 200 miles of river frontage. They've used every possible method: forged documents, intimidated sellers, bribed officials, and in at least 7 cases, I can document arranged for convenient deaths of uncooperative property owners. 7 murders, Tokala asked grimly. 7 I can prove. There are probably additional cases where evidence was more thoroughly concealed. Badger's expression hardened. These people represent millions of dollars in potential profit, and they've shown repeatedly they'll kill anyone interfering with their plans. The sound of horses and voices in the distance interrupted their conversation, growing louder as Pike's search party worked down into the hidden valley. Through the cabin's single window, they could see torch flames dancing among trees as the posse approached their refuge. How much time? Elise asked, already gathering the most important documents into a leather satchel Badger handed her. "Perhaps 10 minutes," he replied, moving with practiced efficiency to pack essential files and evidence. "But don't worry, I've been preparing for this possibility for months." He led them to the cabin's back, where a concealed door opened onto a narrow passage cut directly into the cliff face. This connects to the old Silver Knife mine workings, a whole network of tunnels with multiple exits scattered throughout the district. We can be miles away before those amateurs figure out where we've gone. As they prepared to enter the tunnel system, Badger handed the document satchel to Elise with careful ceremony. "These papers contain enough evidence to destroy the entire conspiracy, but they're worthless unless they reach proper authorities. We need to get this evidence to someone with power to act on it." "What about Deputy Pike?" Tokala asked. "He may be following Thorne's orders, but he doesn't seem like a natural killer." "Well, Pike is a weak man caught up in forces larger than he comprehends," Badger replied thoughtfully. "Weak men can be dangerous when cornered, but they can sometimes be redeemed if presented with right incentives. Don't count on his conscience, but don't assume he's irredeemably evil either." The sound of voices outside was growing much louder, and they could hear Pike calling for them to surrender peacefully while his men surrounded the cabin. Badger extinguished oil lamps and led them into the tunnel just as heavy boots began climbing the front porch steps. As they made their way through dark passage, guided only by Badger's intimate knowledge of mine workings, Elise clutched the leather satchel and tried processing everything she'd learned. Her mother had owned valuable land she'd never mentioned. Thorne was a wanted criminal rather than legitimate preacher. The drought and community hysteria had been deliberately orchestrated to provide cover for systematic murder and theft. Most shocking of all, she was not merely a victim in this conspiracy, she was the key to the entire scheme. Her death would unlock millions of dollars for men who had already killed multiple times to achieve their goals. The frightened little orphan girl was actually one of the wealthiest landowners in the territory, though she'd lived in complete ignorance of her inheritance. But knowledge could be as dangerous as ignorance. Now that she understood the true stakes, then the men hunting her would never give up the chase. They literally could not afford to let her live long enough to tell her story to proper authorities. The tunnel ahead split into 3 separate passages, each leading deeper into the mountain's heart. Badger paused at the junction, listening for any sound of pursuit from behind them. "This way," he said, finally choosing the middle passage. "There's an exit near the old stamp mill. From there we can reach the main road without crossing open country." But even as he spoke, a tremendous rumbling sound echoed through tunnels behind them. The walls shook, dust cascaded from the ceiling, and a wave of displaced air rushed past, carrying the smell of smoke and explosives. "They've collapsed the entrance," Badger said grimly. "Pike must have brought dynamite. They're not planning to take us alive." In darkness ahead, they could hear running water, an underground stream diverted through mine workings decades earlier. But they could also hear something else that made Elise's blood run cold, distant echo of voices and footsteps, suggesting their pursuers had found another entrance and were already inside the mountain with them. The chase was far from over, and their enemies were closer than ever. The old stamp mill rose against the starlit sky like the skeleton of some enormous prehistoric creature, its massive timbers dark with age and abandonment. Water from underground springs had been diverted through wooden sluices to power machinery that once crushed tons of silver ore. But now the wheel stood silent and sluices ran empty except for wind whispers through rotted planks. Badger led them through ruins with confidence of someone who'd explored every inch during his years of hiding and research. "There's a storage building on the far side connecting to another tunnel system," he explained as they picked their way between twisted metal and collapsed walkways. "From there we can reach the main road." But as they approached the building, Tokala held up his hand for silence. His warrior instincts had detected something wrong in the shadow patterns near the building. "Someone is there," he whispered, "waiting." They crouched behind mining timbers and peered into darkness. After several tense minutes, a small red glow appeared briefly near the shed's entrance. Someone drawing on a cigarette, revealing their position to observant watchers. "Pike's been cleverer than I anticipated," Badger muttered. "He must have split his force and sent men to watch all known exits while the main group pursued us through tunnels." "How many other ways out?" Elise asked. "3 I know of, but if they're covering this one, they're probably watching the others too." Badger studied terrain around the mill. "There is one option, but it's extremely dangerous, even for experienced miners with proper equipment." He pointed toward the mill's great water wheel suspended over a deep pool fed by underground springs. "That pool connects to a flooded section of lower mine workings. If we could swim down about 50 feet and follow the tunnel, it emerges at Raven's Gulch bottom about 3 miles downstream." Tokala shook his head immediately. The girl cannot swim 50 feet underwater, especially through mine shafts, where she could become lost or trapped. "I can swim," Elise said quietly. "My mother taught me in the Missouri River when I was small. But 50 feet through dark tunnels." She shivered at the thought. "There should be air pockets along the route," Badger suggested, though he didn't sound entirely confident. "Miners who worked that section always claimed there were places where you could surface and breathe." Before they could debate, further voices erupted from their rear direction as Pike's main force worked through collapsed tunnel systems and emerged at the mill site. Torchlight began dancing among machinery as searchers spread out to cover all possible hiding places. "Not there." Pike's voice carried clearly. "I saw movement near the water wheel." Rifle shots immediately began crackling around their position bullets, striking stone and timber, with sharp impacts that sent dangerous splinters flying. Tokala pulled Elise behind a massive gear housing as more shots rang out ricochets, whining off metal surfaces and creating deadly crossfire. "The pool," he said urgently. "It may be our only remaining option." They ran in a crouch toward the mill's stone foundation, where the great wheel's axle disappeared into housing built around natural springs. The pool was perhaps 20 feet across, and so dark they couldn't determine depth, but the sound of flowing water suggested it connected to the underground stream system Badger had described. "I'll go first," Badger announced, already stripping off his heavy coat and boots. "If I don't surface within 5 minutes, find another route." But before he could enter the water, a new voice cut through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, a voice that made Elise's blood freeze with recognition. "Miss Hart." Reverend Thorne stood on the mill's main platform like some dark angel of vengeance, his tall figure silhouetted against torchlight. "This foolishness has continued quite long enough. Come forward and accept the judgment divine providence has prepared." Elise pressed herself deeper into shadows behind the wheel housing. But Thorne seemed to know exactly where she was concealed. "You cannot escape your ordained destiny, child. The Almighty has marked you for sacrifice, and all the heathen warriors and misguided hermits in the territory cannot alter that fundamental truth. Your blood will water this barren earth and bring salvation to the righteous. My blood will water nothing except your bank account." Elise called back, her fear suddenly transformed into blazing anger. "I know about the land inheritance, Thorne. I know about the railroad money and forged guardianship papers. You're not a man of God. You're nothing but a common thief and murderer." Her accusation hung in the night air like a challenge. And for several seconds, the shooting stopped as both sides absorbed the implications. Then Thorne's laughter echoed through mill ruins, cold and utterly devoid of human warmth. "Clever girl, very clever indeed. Yes, I'm fully aware that you've spoken with our friend Badger and learned more than is healthy for someone in your precarious position. But knowledge without power is merely a burden that hastens one's destruction." He gestured toward armed men positioned throughout the mill complex. "Even if you could somehow escape from this place alive, who would believe the testimony of an orphan girl against the sworn word of a man of God who would accept claims of a hostile Indian and discredited mining clerk over official statements of a deputy sheriff and dozen respectable citizens. Deputy Pike stepped into the torchlight beside Thorne, his badge catching flames like a small star. But Elise could see something in his weathered face that hadn't been there before, doubt perhaps, or the beginning of genuine remorse. "This has gone far enough, Reverend," Pike said quietly, voice barely audible above wind through broken timbers. "The girl is just a child caught up in adult problems. Maybe we should reconsider our approach." "Reconsider what?" Thorne's voice cracked like a whip. "Doesn't require justice, doesn't require the community to defend itself against corruption, doesn't require us to fulfill our sacred obligations regardless of personal squeamishness." He drew a pistol from inside his black coat and pointed it, not at the hiding fugitives, but directly at Pike himself. "You seem to be developing inconvenient scruples at a most inappropriate time, Deputy. Perhaps you've forgotten which side provides your salary." Pike stared at the weapon aimed at his chest, and Elise could see the exact moment when he realized how completely he'd been manipulated. His hand moved toward his own revolver, but Thorne was already squeezing the trigger. The shot echoed through the mill like thunder, and Pike crumpled to the wooden platform with a cry of pain and shock. Blood began spreading across his shirt as he pressed both hands against a wound in his side, his face pale with sudden understanding that he'd become expendable. "Let that serve as an object lesson," Thorne announced to his remaining followers. But Elise could see that the cold-blooded shooting had shaken several of them, causing some men to back away, with expressions of doubt and growing alarm. That was when Pike, despite his wound and overwhelming agony, managed to do something that surprised everyone present. Fighting through pain that would have incapacitated most men, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object that caught torchlight as he held it up for Elise to see clearly. It was her pewter locket, the one that had broken and fallen during their escape from Cinder Bluff. "I should have returned this sooner," he called out, voice weak, but determined despite blood loss. "It fell in the street during the shooting, and I picked it up without thinking. I didn't understand its significance until I opened it and saw the photograph inside." Elise felt her heart stop as she realized what he was about to reveal. The photograph in her locket was a formal portrait of her mother, taken shortly before her death. How could Pike possibly recognize a woman he'd never met? "Your mother was my sister." Pike continued pressing one hand against his bleeding wound while holding up the locket with the other. "Elizabeth Mason, before she married your father and became Elizabeth Hart. I thought she died of natural causes in Kansas. But I learned the real truth tonight. He was involved in her death, helped arrange the whole thing to steal her property claim." The revelation struck Elise like a series of physical blows. Deputy Pike, the man who'd been hunting her across the territory, was her uncle, her mother's younger brother family she'd never known existed. But Pike wasn't finished. Blood loss had weakened him, but it had also freed him from the careful self-control that had governed his actions for years. Now, with nothing left to lose, he spoke the truth that had been burning inside him. "I knew her," he said, his voice growing stronger even as his body grew weaker. 20 years ago, when I was a young constable in Kansas, there was a land fraud case that came across my desk. A family named Reverend Abel Thorne and his associates were accused of swindling homesteaders out of their claims. The evidence was solid, but Thorne had connections, political influence. The case disappeared from my desk one morning, and I was told to forget about it. Pike coughed and blood appeared at the corner of his mouth, but he continued. "I was young, ambitious. I needed the job, needed the approval of my superiors. So I let it go. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that someone else would handle it. But that decision haunted me. One of the families Thorne destroyed, they lost everything, including their daughter. She was just a child, and she died that winter from exposure and hunger." He looked directly at Thorne, who had gone very still. That's when you became a killer, isn't it, Abel? When you realized that stealing land wasn't enough, you needed to eliminate the witnesses, the people who might identify you later. My cowardice 20 years ago helped create the monster you became. Thorne's face had gone pale with rage. You're delirious from blood loss, old man. Nobody will believe the ravings of a dying fool. Maybe not, Pike agreed. But they'll believe this. From his other pocket, he withdrew a small leather notebook. I've been keeping records, Thorne. Names, dates, payments, every bribe you offered me, every illegal order you gave. I told myself I was just covering my own back, but really I was waiting for the courage to do what I should have done 20 years ago. He threw the notebook toward Elise with the last of his failing strength. Everything's in there. Bank transfers, meeting locations, even some of the forged documents. Take it and run, niece. Run and don't trust anyone who claims to represent law and order until you find someone you know is clean. But there was no time for emotional reunion or detailed explanations. Thorne was raising his pistol again this time, aiming directly at the shadows where the fugitives were hiding. Enough of this sentimental melodrama, he snarled. I'm tired of delays and complications. Come out immediately, or I'll have my men burn you out like vermin. The water, Tokala urged, pulling Elise toward the edge of the dark pool. We have no other choice remaining. Badger was already in the water up to his waist, his white hair streaming behind him as he prepared for the desperate underwater journey. Follow the current, he called back urgently. Don't fight against it. Let it carry you through the tunnel system. And whatever happens, don't panic if the passage becomes narrow. Then he disappeared beneath the surface with barely a splash, leaving only ripples to mark where he'd vanished into the flooded mine workings. Tokala helped Elise into the shockingly cold water, which was so much colder than the river crossing that it drove breath from her lungs immediately and made her muscles cramp. Above them, Thorne's men were moving closer with their torches. Can you do this? Tokala asked, treading water beside her while fighting his own exhaustion and injuries. Elise clutched her mother's locket and Pike's notebook against her chest and thought about everything she'd learned, everything she'd lost, and everything that still needed to be fought for. Somewhere beyond this dark pool lay evidence that could destroy Thorne's conspiracy and bring justice for all his victims. I can do it, she said with more confidence than she felt. They took deep breaths simultaneously and dove together into the unknown darkness, following Badger into the flooded heart of the mountain just as the first of Thorne's torches reached the water's edge behind them. She could hear the Reverend screaming orders to his men, his voice echoing off stone walls like the howling of some maddened beast. But the water closed over her head, and his curses became meaningless noise that could no longer reach or harm her. She was swimming toward truth and justice, even if that destination lay hidden in the deepest darkness she'd ever known. The flooded tunnel was a nightmare realm of frigid water and absolute blackness that seemed designed to claim the lives of anyone foolish enough to enter its depths. Elise followed the current deeper into the mountain, her lungs already burning from the effort of swimming while holding her breath and fighting against the weight of her waterlogged clothing. The passage angled steadily downward for what felt like an eternity, then began rising again just as she thought her chest would explode from oxygen starvation. Her head finally broke the surface in a small air pocket where the tunnel roof curved upward, and she gasped desperately while trying to remain silent despite her body's urgent need for air. Tokala's voice came from somewhere nearby in the complete darkness. Here, came the reply, echoing strangely off invisible stone walls. The current continues ahead. We're almost through the worst section. They dove again, and this time, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber where phosphorescent deposits on the walls provided an eerie greenish glow that allowed them to see their surroundings clearly for the first time. The chamber contained the rusted remains of mining equipment, rail tracks disappearing under water timber, supports green with decades of fungal growth, and the skeletal framework of ore cars. But Elise could also see something that made her blood freeze, lights moving through the water behind them. indicating that some of Thorne's men had followed them into the flooded mine workings, using waterproof lanterns to navigate the submerged passages. "They're still coming," she whispered as they reached another air pocket. "Then we keep moving forward," Badger replied grimly. "The exit is just ahead, but it's going to be the most difficult part of the entire journey." He was absolutely right. The final passage was a vertical shaft that rose nearly 40 feet through solid rock, filled with water so cold it numbed their extremities within seconds. Elise felt her strength failing rapidly as she fought her way upward, her heavy dress acting like an anchor that resisted every movement. Tokala, despite his wounded leg and infected shoulder, somehow managed to stay beside her throughout the ascent, sometimes supporting her weight when her muscles threatened to give out completely. Above them, a circle of starlight beckoned like salvation itself. They finally broke through into night air, gasping and shivering, as they pulled themselves onto a rocky ledge beside a stream that wound through the bottom of a narrow canyon. The walls rose steeply on both sides, but there was a rough path following the water downstream toward what they hoped would be the main valley. "How long before they follow us up?" Elise asked through chattering teeth. "Not long at all," Badger admitted reluctantly. "But we have a small head start, and they'll be just as exhausted as we are." His words were interrupted by the sound of voices echoing from the flooded shaft behind them. Their pursuers were already climbing toward the surface, some close enough to emerge within minutes. "This way," Tokala said, pointing downstream along the treacherous canyon path. "We need distance more than rest." They began working their way carefully along the rocky trail, using moonlight and starshine to navigate between boulders and fallen timber. Behind them, they could hear Thorne's men emerging from the water and organizing for continued pursuit. But as they rounded a bend in the stream, they encountered something that brought them to an abrupt halt, another group of armed men, positioned across the path with military precision. These newcomers wore different uniforms than Pike's posse. The distinctive blue jackets and brass buttons of Territorial Railroad Police professional gunmen whose loyalty could be purchased with gold rather than motivated by religious fanaticism. "That's quite far enough," their leader announced, his voice carrying confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Drop any weapons and raise your hands." Elise felt her heart sink as she recognized the significance of the railroad uniforms. The Rail and Water Company had brought in their own enforcement arm, eliminating any pretense that this was about community justice. "Us Captain Morrison," Badger said with weary recognition, slowly raising his hands. "I should have anticipated your direct involvement. Still taking corporate money to ignore inconvenient laws, Morrison was a thick-set man in his 40s, with weathered face and cold eyes of someone who'd spent years in frontier law enforcement before selling his integrity to the highest bidder. His smile was professionally cordial as he recognized the old mining clerk. Thomas Badger, amateur detective and professional troublemaker. "You really should have minded your own business. Now you've forced us to clean up a situation that could have been resolved more quietly. My business is protecting innocent people from murderers and thieves." "Innocent?" Morrison's laugh was harsh and devoid of humor. "That girl represents more money than most people see in several lifetimes. Her property claim is the key to the largest development project in territorial history. Nothing personal, this is simply business conducted on a scale that requires decisive action." Behind them, Thorne's surviving followers were approaching through the canyon, their torches creating a slowly tightening circle of light and armed men. Elise clutched the leather document satchel and Pike's notebook against her chest, trying to think of some way to transform their evidence into a weapon against overwhelming odds. That was when she heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope, the distant whistle of a locomotive approaching through the mountain valleys. The railroad line that served the mining district ran through Raven's Gulch less than a mile downstream from their current position following the canyon floor, before emerging onto the main valley where freight trains carried ore to smelters in distant cities. If they could somehow reach those tracks before a train passed, they might be able to flag it down and escape their pursuers. But first they had to get past Morrison and his professional killers. Tokala seemed to be thinking along similar lines. "The midnight freight," he said quietly, just loud enough for Elise and Badger to hear. "It runs every Tuesday night, carrying processed ore to the territorial capital." "Won't do you any good," Morrison replied, having overheard. "Too many armed men between you and those tracks. Time to accept reality, folks. This is the end of your journey." But Elise was studying the terrain around them with desperate intensity. The stream beside their path was running high and fast from recent rains, creating a series of small waterfalls and rapids where it dropped over natural ledges. "Oh, Tokala," she whispered urgently, "can you reach that pile of loose rock above Morrison's position?" He followed her gaze and understood her plan immediately. A substantial rock slide was balanced precariously on a narrow ledge 20 feet above the railroad. Men held in place by only a few key stones and the exposed roots of a dead pine tree. "If I can get there without being detected," he replied dubiously. "But it would be extremely dangerous in this lighting." That was when Badger proved that his years hiding in abandoned mine workings had taught him more than just record-keeping. From inside his coat, he produced a stick of dynamite with a short fuse, the kind used for small-scale excavation work. "I always carry emergency supplies," he explained with a grim smile. "Never know when you might need to open a blocked tunnel." Morrison had noticed their whispered conference and was becoming increasingly suspicious. "No more conversation," he ordered sharply. "Line up against that rock wall where my men can keep you properly covered." Instead of complying, Badger struck a match and lit the dynamite fuse, then hurled the explosive toward the rockfall above Morrison's position with accuracy born of years, placing charges in precisely the right locations. The stick landed perfectly in a crevice between loose stones, and the railroad men barely had time to look up before the night exploded around them. The blast brought down tons of rock and debris in a thunderous avalanche that created instant chaos among both groups of their enemies. Morrison's men scattered for cover, some diving into the stream, while others pressed themselves against canyon walls as boulders bounced and rolled through their positions. In the confusion, Tokala launched himself at the nearest railroad policeman, his warrior training allowing him to overcome the disadvantage of his injured leg through superior technique and desperate determination. They went down in a fierce struggle for control of the man's rifle. Elise grabbed Badger's arm and they ran downstream toward the sound of the approaching locomotive, the precious documents clutched against her chest. Behind them, she could hear Morrison shouting orders, while Thorne's voice added to the pandemonium as the two groups of pursuers collided in the narrow canyon. The train whistle was much closer now, and she could see the bright glow of the locomotive's headlight painting canyon walls with moving shadows. But the tracks were still hundreds of yards away, and their enemies were recovering quickly from the initial shock. Gunshots began crackling through the night as both groups resumed their pursuit, and the sound echoing off stone walls until it resembled a pitched battle. Elise felt a bullet tug at her waterlogged dress, then another that struck sparks from a boulder beside her head. They reached a wider section of the canyon, where the railroad trestle bridge crossed the stream, its massive wooden framework rising like a geometric forest against the star-filled sky. The locomotive was approaching from the east, its headlight now visible as a brilliant star that grew larger with each passing second. "The bridge," Badger shouted over the sound of the approaching train and gunfire behind them. "We can signal the engineer from the center span." They began climbing the steep embankment toward the rail line, using timber supports and steel cables as handholds, while the entire structure vibrated from the weight and speed of the approaching locomotive. The wooden beams groaned under the train's massive bulk, and Elise could feel tremors running through every bolt and rivet. But Morrison had anticipated their desperate gambit. He appeared at the far end of the bridge with several of his surviving men, effectively blocking their escape route with a disciplined line of rifles. "Nowhere left to run," he called out with professional satisfaction. Simultaneously, Thorne emerged from the canyon below, with the remnants of his posse completing the encirclement on the narrow trestle, where there was no cover and no room for maneuvering. The locomotive was perhaps a quarter-mile away, and approaching fast, its whistles shrieking warnings that echoed off the canyon walls. "You have less than 1 minute to surrender," Morrison announced with cold calculation, "before that engine turns you all into bloody fragments." Elise looked at the approaching train, and then at the armed men surrounding them on both sides, and then at the dark water rushing far below the bridge. They were completely trapped, with no apparent way to escape. That was when she made a decision that surprised everyone present, including herself. Instead of surrendering or attempting to flee, she did something that would either save them all or kill them in the most spectacular fashion possible. As the locomotive thundered closer, its headlight now blazing like a second sun, she grabbed Tokala's hand and made a desperate calculation. "The train," she shouted over the deafening noise. "We jump onto the train?" It was insane. The locomotive was traveling at tremendous speed, and jumping from a stationary bridge onto a moving train was the kind of stunt that killed circus performers with years of experience. But it was also completely unexpected, and sometimes the impossible succeeded precisely because no one anticipated it. When I say jump, Tokala understood immediately, his warrior instincts recognizing the desperate brilliance of her plan. We leaped toward the freight cars, not the engine. The locomotive roared beneath them like a mechanical dragon, its smokestack belching sparks and cinders into the night sky. Behind it came a string of freight cars, loaded with processed ore, their tops flat and accessible to anyone bold enough or desperate enough to attempt the jump. "Now!" Elise screamed, and they leapt together into space. For one terrifying moment, they hung suspended above certain death, the canyon floor rushing past beneath their feet, while the train's steel wheels shrieked against the rails. Then Tokala's moccasins hit the roof of a freight car, and he rolled with the impact to absorb the shock. Elise landed beside him, a split second later, her dress tearing as she slid across the rough wooden planking. Badger, despite his age, proved he still possessed the reflexes that had kept him alive in dangerous mines for decades. His jump carried him to the next car, back where he landed hard but intact, immediately rolling toward the center of the roof to avoid being thrown off by the train's swaying motion. Behind them on the bridge, their enemies could only watch in stunned amazement as their quarry disappeared into the night, on top of a speeding freight train. Morrison was already shouting orders to pursue them along the tracks, but the locomotive was moving too fast for horses to follow, and by the time they could organize a proper chase, their prey would be miles away. But their troubles were far from over. As Elise struggled to her feet on the swaying car roof, she realized that riding on top of a freight train traveling at full speed through mountain terrain was almost as dangerous as jumping onto it had been. The wind threatened to tear her from the roof, sparks from the locomotive showered down like deadly rain, and every curve in the tracks threatened to throw them into the canyon. Worse yet, they were not alone on the train. Shouts from behind indicated that some of Morrison's railroad police had been positioned further down the line, and they were now climbing up from inside the freight cars to continue the pursuit on top of the speeding train. "Keep moving forward." Tokala shouted over the wind and engine noise, his voice barely audible above the mechanical symphony of steel wheels on iron rails. "We need to reach the engine." What followed was the most dangerous and desperate chase of Elise's young life. Jumping from car to car while the train swayed and bucked through mountain curves, pursued by professional gunmen who had the advantage of familiarity with railroad operations. Bullets whistled past their heads as they ran and jumped and rolled across the freight cars, the canyon floor rushing past hundreds of feet below them. Tokala, despite his injured leg, proved that years of warrior training had prepared him for exactly this kind of desperate situation. He helped Elise across the gaps between cars, shielded her from gunfire with his own body, and fought hand-to-hand with railroad police when running became impossible. The climax came as they reached the tender car directly behind the locomotive, where the train's supply of coal and water was stored. Morrison himself had somehow gotten ahead of them, emerging from the engine cab, with a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. "End of the line," he snarled, taking careful aim at Elise's heart. But Tokala had one final desperate gambit. Using the last of his strength, he tackled Morrison around the waist, and they both went tumbling across the coal pile, fighting for control of the rifle, while the locomotive swayed through a series of sharp curves. The gun went off during their struggle, the bullet ricocheting off the engine's boiler and sending up a shower of sparks. Morrison was stronger and heavier, but Tokala fought with the desperation of a man protecting the only family he had left in the world. In the end, it was Morrison's own arrogance that destroyed him. Confident in his superior size and strength, he tried to throw Tokala from the moving train. But the Lakota warrior had spent his life understanding balance and leverage, and he used Morrison's own momentum to send the railroad captain tumbling from the tender car into the darkness below. As the train began to slow, approaching the main rail yard in Broken Arrow, Elise helped Tokala bind his new wounds and tried to process everything that had happened. They had escaped Thorne's religious fanatics and Morrison's corporate killers, but they were still fugitives with a price on their heads. The evidence they carried could destroy the conspiracy, but only if they could get it to someone with the power and integrity to act on it. That was when Badger, who had somehow managed to survive the entire ordeal with his precious documents intact, pointed toward the rail yard ahead of them, where a familiar figure stood waiting on the platform. "Well, I'll be damned," he said with the first genuine smile Elise had seen from him. "It looks like the cavalry has finally arrived." The man waiting for them was Federal Marshal James Harrison, and the star pinned to his vest represented the power of the United States government, power that even the rail and water company couldn't buy or intimidate. As the freight train ground to a halt in a shower of sparks and hissing steam, Elise realized that their desperate flight was finally over. Justice would at last have its day in court, and the truth would set them all free. But first, she had a promise to keep to her uncle, whose sacrifice had made their victory possible. She would see that Caleb Pike was remembered not for his mistakes, but for his courage when it mattered most. The territorial courthouse in Broken Arrow had never witnessed scenes like those that unfolded during what newspapers throughout the region called the Railroad Conspiracy Trial. Federal Judge William Morrison, no relation to the deceased railroad captain, presided over proceedings with the stern efficiency of someone who had encountered every form of frontier corruption during 2 decades on the bench. At the prosecution table, Territorial Attorney General Samuel Harrison spread documents from Badger's satchel and Pike's notebook across the polished surface like pieces of an intricate puzzle that finally revealed its complete picture. Each paper contributed to the story, forged guardianship orders, payment authorizations from the rail and water company, altered land surveys designed to inflate property values, and most damning of all, detailed correspondence between Abel Thorne and corporate executives discussing the systematic removal of obstacles to their development plans. Thomas Badger, now properly dressed and groomed for his crucial role as the prosecution's primary witness, took the stand with quiet confidence of a man who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. The defendant corporation employed various methods to acquire properties they wanted for railroad expansion. He testified, consulting detailed notes from his extensive files. Sometimes they used straightforward bribery of local officials. In other cases, they created forged documents claiming prior ownership. But when those methods proved insufficient, they invariably resorted to violence. He methodically detailed how the company had recruited men like Morrison and Thorne to eliminate problematic property owners using different cover stories depending on local conditions. In some communities, victims were accused of being Confederate sympathizers. In others, they were branded as Indian collaborators or threats to public morality. The methodology was consistent regardless of specific justification. Badger continued with clinical precision. First, identify valuable property with unclear ownership or vulnerable proprietor. Second, create local crisis justifying removal of current owner. Third, use legitimate authority figures to provide legal cover. Finally, acquire the property through territorial auction at a fraction of true value. Elise sat in the front row between Beatrice Rowan and a federal marshal assigned as her temporary guardian, listening to testimony with a mixture of satisfaction and lingering sadness. Justice was finally being served, but it could not restore the lives lost to the conspiracy's greed and violence. Deputy Pike, still recovering from his gunshot wound, but no longer wearing a badge, occupied a seat in the defendant's section, awaiting his own sentencing for enabling the criminal enterprise. When called to testify, he spoke in a voice barely audible, but carrying clearly in the hushed courtroom. I knew something was fundamentally wrong. He admitted, eyes focused on his folded hands rather than faces watching from the gallery. But I needed the income from my position to pay medical debts from my wife's final illness. I convinced myself that I was simply following legitimate orders and maintaining public order. His testimony proved devastating to any remaining rail and water company claims of innocence. He provided specific details about conversations with company representatives, documented payments disguised as consulting fees, and described systematic intimidation of anyone who questioned the corporation's methods. But Pike's most powerful testimony came when he described his personal connection to the case. 20 years ago, when I was a young constable in Kansas, I was assigned to investigate a land fraud case involving Abel Thorne and his associates. The evidence was solid. They had systematically swindled homesteading families out of their legal claims through forged documents and intimidation. But Thorne had political connections influence with my superiors. Pike's voice grew stronger as he continued, the weight of decades falling from his shoulders. The case file disappeared from my desk one morning, and I was told to forget about it. I was young, ambitious, needed the job and approval of my superiors. So I let it go. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that someone else would handle it. He looked up for the first time during his testimony, his eyes finding Elise's face in the courtroom. That decision haunted me for 20 years. One of the families Thorne destroyed lost everything, including their young daughter who died that winter from exposure and hunger. My cowardice helped create the monster Abel Thorne became, and it ultimately led to the death of my sister Elizabeth and the threat to my niece Elise. The courtroom was completely silent as Pike concluded his testimony. Some mistakes are too enormous to live with. Some principles matter more than job security or personal comfort. I can't undo the harm I caused through my cowardice 20 years ago, but I can ensure that the truth is finally told and justice is finally served. The trial continued for 6 days, with witnesses traveling from throughout the territory to testify about suspicious deaths, fraudulent land acquisitions, and systematic corruption of local officials. Representatives of the Rail and Water Company attempted to claim complete ignorance of their hired agents' criminal activities, but the documentary evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. In the end, the corporation was ordered to pay damages totaling nearly $600,000 to victims' families and communities that had been defrauded. Several corporate executives received federal prison sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years for conspiracy, mail fraud, and racketeering. The company itself was permanently barred from further operations in the territory and placed under federal oversight for all activities in other states. Judge Morrison took considerable time during his closing remarks to address the broader implications of the case. This conspiracy succeeded for as long as it did because it systematically exploited our most fundamental fears and prejudices. The judge observed with evident gravity. Fear of economic hardship and natural disasters. Prejudice against orphans, immigrants, and anyone perceived as different. The dangerous willingness to believe that someone else's suffering might somehow alleviate our own troubles. He looked directly at Elise as he delivered his final observations. But it was ultimately defeated by courage and moral determination that refused to be intimidated by superior numbers or firepower. By people who chose to do what was right, even when it was personally dangerous and offered no immediate reward. Pike received a sentence of 18 months in territorial prison for his role in the conspiracy, but Judge Morrison took his cooperation and final redemptive actions into account when determining punishment. He would be eligible for parole in 12 months, and there was already discussion about offering him employment, helping other communities identify and resist similar criminal schemes. 2 months after the trial concluded, Elise stood on the banks of the Snake River watching construction crews put finishing touches on a new wooden bridge designed to handle both pedestrian traffic and light freight loads. The structure was simple, but built to last, with a brass dedication plaque reading "Pike's Crossing" in straightforward block letters. The bridge had been funded through the Rail and Water Company's court-ordered restitution payments. But the design and much of the labor had been donated by local residents who wanted to create something positive from the tragedy that had devastated their community. Lakota craftsmen worked alongside Mexican carpenters, Irish railroad workers, and German farmers, creating a structure that belonged to everyone and served the common good. "It's a solid bridge," Tokala observed, joining her beside the water with the aid of a walking stick he'd carved from seasoned oak. His leg would never fully heal, but he'd regained enough mobility to continue his work as a cultural liaison and interpreter. Strong enough to last for generations, simple enough for any community to maintain. "I'm glad it bears Uncle Caleb's name," Elise replied, still adjusting to the reality of having family she'd never known about. He made terrible mistakes, but he tried to redeem himself when it truly mattered. "Your property claim has been completely validated and cleared of all legal challenges," Beatrice announced, approaching them with a leather portfolio containing official documents. As Elise's legal guardian and adoptive mother, she had overseen the complex process of establishing clear title to the 40 acres Elizabeth Mason had claimed before her daughter's birth. "The Territorial Land Office confirms that you own the ferry crossing and all mineral rights to the entire section," Beatrice continued. "Conservative estimates suggest the property could be worth several $100,000 if developed commercially. It represented enormous inheritance for a 15-year-old girl, enough wealth to ensure comfort and security for the rest of her life. But Elise had already decided how she wanted to use her unexpected fortune, and her decision reflected lessons learned through hardship and loss. "I want to deed the ferry crossing to the territorial government as a permanent public right-of-way," she announced, producing documents she'd prepared with help from Thomas Badger, who had established a legitimate legal practice specializing in property rights and corporate accountability. "The crossing should belong to everyone who needs to use it, not just whoever can afford tolls," she explained. "And I want to grant permanent water rights to the Lakota families who winter upstream, so they'll never again face the threat of someone damming their water source for private profit." Tokala studied her with something approaching amazement. "You would voluntarily surrender so much potential wealth?" "I'm not surrendering anything," Elise corrected with quiet conviction. "I'm using it exactly the way it should be used. My mother filed that claim to help people build better lives, not to make herself rich at others' expense. This feels like honoring her memory properly." She retained ownership of the mineral rights, but established a trust that would use any future income to fund schools and medical facilities for communities throughout the territory. It was a level of generosity that surprised even federal officials who processed the paperwork. But Elise had learned crucial lessons about the difference between having money and having security. As the sun set over the high prairie, painting the endless grasslands in shades of gold and crimson, Elise walked to the center of the new bridge and stood looking down at the clear water flowing beneath her feet. She pulled her mother's locket from inside her dress and opened it to study the familiar face in the faded photograph. "I hope you're proud of the person I'm becoming, Mama," she whispered to the image with quiet reverence. "I think I'm finally understanding what you wanted me to learn about courage and justice, and taking care of people who can't protect themselves." A year later, travelers through the region would discover a thriving community centered around Pike's Crossing, complete with a school medical clinic and trading posts serving people from dozens of different cultural backgrounds. The bridge had become a symbol of cooperation and justice, proof that decent people could overcome even the most entrenched corruption when they worked together toward common goals. Elise Hart, now 16 and widely recognized as one of the most influential young women in the territory, divided her time between continued education with Beatrice and managing the charitable trust that had grown from her mother's legacy. She never married, though she attracted several suitors preferring to dedicate her life to causes that brought genuine meaning and purpose to her existence. Thomas Badger established a permanent office in the region, helping small property owners protect their rights while continuing to expose fraud and corruption wherever he discovered it. His network of informants and meticulous record-keeping made him one of the most effective opponents of territorial corruption feared by dishonest officials throughout the Southwest. Tokala continued his work bridging cultural divides, but now he held an official federal appointment as a territorial liaison with authority to investigate disputes and negotiate peaceful resolutions. His walking stick reminded him daily of the physical cost of violence, but it also served as a symbol of his commitment to protecting innocent people from those who would exploit them. On quiet evenings, when the wind whispered across the prairie and the setting sun transformed the Snake River into a ribbon of molten gold, all three of them would sometimes gather on Pike's Crossing to remember the people they had lost and celebrate the community they had helped to create. The bridge stood strong and true, carrying travelers safely across waters that had once divided communities and cultures. It was a simple structure built from local materials and honest labor, but it represented something much more significant: the possibility of redemption, and the power of truth over lies, and the enduring strength of people who choose to do what is right, regardless of personal cost. In the gathering darkness, lanterns began to flicker in windows throughout the valley, each light representing a family that lived in safety because a few determined individuals had refused to let greed and corruption triumph over justice. The world was not perfect, it never would be, but it was demonstrably better than the one they had inherited. And that Elise reflected as she headed home to the schoolhouse where Beatrice waited with warm soup and fresh bread was more than sufficient. It was everything that mattered, everything worth fighting for, everything that gave life meaning and purpose in an often harsh and unforgiving world. The stars emerged one by one in the vast western sky, eternal witnesses to human struggles and triumphs, while the river flowed endlessly toward distant oceans, carrying the hopes and dreams of all who had touched its banks.